Thanks very much. Firstly, thank you so much for not being put off by maybe three of the most boring words that exist in the English dictionary: carbon calculators and banking. But what I do hope is that by the end of this, you'll be as excited as I am about the potential for the combination that this can have on the climate crisis. So I'm going to take you back to the 19th of July. If you're in the UK, I imagine you well remember sweating uncontrollably in your office or in your home. This was the day that the UK reached its hottest ever recorded temperature. And at the other end of the spectrum, in Pakistan, we saw these floods, these desperate floods. You know, the reality was that the rainfall was 780% higher than the average levels of rainfalls. The reality is that we are all seeing and feeling the impact of climate change, and climate anxiety is on the rise. There was an article in The Guardian a little while ago that actually said that this is now one of the top 3 drivers of stress in Gen Zs. There was a survey done by the European Commission, and it said that 93% of EU citizens believe that climate change is a serious problem. And 90% support the EU's aim of moving to a carbon-neutral economy by 2050. And really depressingly, there are 57% of people that think fundamentally we're doomed. Now, I'm not going to stop there, so that's a good part. You know, I work at Cogo, and we're constantly asked, can individuals really make a difference? Well, the answer is yes. And the most striking example of that was the recent pandemic. Now, lockdown was horrendous. No one's going to deny that. But when we were forced to stop, we suddenly saw the effects of human pollution. We saw clean air, we saw blue skies, and there was no noise pollution. In fact, there were even sightings of dolphins in the canals in Venice. Now, I'm not really sure about that one, but let's go with it. We saw these striking images here in The Guardian. You know, the smog-free cities. And suddenly we were presented with the very visible impact that we as human beings are having on the planet. And it wasn't just us, right? Climate scientists saw it too. Carbon emissions dropped by 7% in 2020 versus 2019. Now, I'm not going to suggest for one second that we stay in lockdown. If you're a parent like me, you'll know that that was horrendous. But what it did expose, what scientists have been saying for a very long time, which is we as individuals can make a significant impact on the climate crisis. Overconsumption was one of the key drivers of climate change, and 70% of greenhouse gases actually relate to household consumption. And research shows that the majority of us want to take action, and we want to drive to a net zero society. So why don't we? Well, knowingly or unknowingly, our values and our actions don't always align. It's actually a phenomenon called the value-action gap. And when it comes to climate action, it's even harder, because the reality is the changes we need to make in our behaviours are often ingrained in very habitual behaviours, like our diet or like our commute. And this is where businesses like mine, Cogo, come in. We use data and behavioural science to help people to measure, understand, and ultimately reduce their carbon footprints. So let's start with how you measure your carbon footprint. You know, the reality is you can't manage what you can't measure. When you're losing weight, you typically stand on some scales. But the challenge with carbon footprints is, where do you start? Well, the reality is our everyday spend closely correlates to your personal carbon emissions. Every company you spend with and every product you buy, from your daily coffee to your TV license, has an impact. And we work with leading carbon footprint experts like Mike Berners-Lee, and we use open banking, and we work directly with banks. And we translate every pound into an emission factor to create personalised carbon footprints. And this here is my personal carbon footprint for last month, which was 1,048 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. That's all the gases that contribute to climate change. Now, we show this to people, and they're like, that's great, really interesting. What does it mean? And I'm sure you're wondering what it means too. This number is only powerful if it's got context. So measuring is pretty tricky, but the real challenge is actually helping people to understand it. And this is where there's a real lack of carbon literacy. And to go back to the analogy of losing weight, you know, we all know things like 10,000 steps or being healthy and 5 a day. How do we make carbon really meaningful in people's lives? So we've tried showing equivalence. We break it down into trees cut down or charges of mobile phone chargers. We talk about it and translate it into coffee consumed, even donuts. And look, you know, it's great fun and it's engaging. But the reality is it actually doesn't help improve carbon literacy. People actually need to be able to relate to their carbon footprints. Here's my carbon footprint again. And this time what you can see is, here's my carbon footprint stacking up against the national average. And I'm sure straight away you're just having a quick check and see how I'm doing. Well, you can see the 1,048 is just below the national average. There is room for improvement. The monthly average is about a tonne. At the other end of the spectrum, you can see the global average here. Actually, this has a really demotivating impact on people. We brought it in because we wanted people to show that people in the UK can have a disproportionate effect, but actually what we see is people disengage. They want to understand how they stack up against people like yourselves. And this is where social comparisons come in. You know, how am I stacking up versus my peers? It's incredibly motivating for individuals to see how they're stacking up. You can see from here I'm in the top 30% of users in terms of the lowest carbon emissions. What you'll also see is we start bringing in game design thinking. So we're encouraging you to get better, to be in the top 20%. And we encourage you to do things like set carbon budgets, challenge yourself. Actually, that's far more motivating than you trying to hit a global average. When we first created this carbon calculator 3 years ago, we didn't want to go into too much detail because we didn't really want to confuse people. But what actually happened was that people wanted to dive into the detail and they wanted to interrogate their carbon footprints. And we actually find that people spend between 4 and 6 minutes looking at their transactions. Is what's good, what's bad, what's having an impact. You know, then they start asking questions. Why has Spotify got a carbon? I didn't know Spotify had a carbon emission. And this is all important in improving that carbon literacy. What we typically see across the carbon households or the carbon footprints of the household is these are the key categories where people have the highest emissions. And you can remember this by all the Fs: food, fashion, finance, flying, fuel, and energy. It's not the energy in, but it kind of works. The reality is we all know and increasingly understand the impacts of flying and food and fashion, but it's really powerful when you suddenly see that presented back to you in a number form and an impact. A return flight to Hong Kong is a quarter of your annual carbon footprint. It's incredibly powerful. So we know that understanding and measuring is really important in terms of a foundational step in carbon literacy. But actually, people need a bit more help to reduce their carbon footprint. And this is where it gets really personal. I'm not going to show you any indecent photos. This here is an attitudinal segmentation wheel that was put together from a study with YouGov and Climate Outreach. What you can see here at a macro level is there is a wide spectrum of attitudes when it comes to taking climate actions. At one extreme, you've got people who are totally disengaged for whatever reason, and it just is not their priority. And at the other extreme, you've got people who are so desperate that they're gluing themselves to trains. And then the majority of us somewhere in the middle on some kind of spectrum of our climate journey. And then there's demographics to consider. Demographics also have a bearing in terms of what's most relevant in terms of you taking climate action. I just want to highlight here, one of the kind of misconceptions is the fact that it's only really Gen Zs that care about the climate crisis. I referred earlier to the kind of climate anxiety. But actually what we see is there's a broad demographic who actually engage with their carbon footprint. And it's also worth showing that you can see the 31 to 35 actually are the most engaged with their carbon footprints. The critical thing about demographics is that it also has a bearing in what is most relevant to you in terms of climate actions. We see a younger cohort of females typically focus more on their fashion footprint, and an older cohort then looking at things like their energy consumption, which is quite logical. And then just to add another level of complexity, there's a whole different dynamic around your willingness to engage with climate actions. But there's also a need for support in terms of whether it's affordable or it's accessible. We did this research with the Behavioural Insights team, which is the old nudge unit set up by the Cabinet, around what are the barriers to people actually taking action. And as you can see, there's quite a lot. So actually, when it comes to helping people to reduce their carbon emissions and giving them the right recommendation, it involves a multitude of considerations and data points. And not only that, we need to make it really simple. Too much complexity drives inertia. And this is where personalization and behavioral science comes into its own. Now, I've spent many years working in customer data analytics. I spent a big chunk of my career using personalization and behavioral science techniques to get people to buy more stuff, and to be honest, drive a lot of revenues to big retailers. I'm also really conscious that these are two of the biggest buzzwords in BS bingo. So what I want to do is just break this down to actually what I mean. You'll all know, right, because we all consume every day, but retailers have been using data and behavioral science for decades. You know, that little nudge you feel when you go into the fast food restaurant. You know, do you want fries with that? Or you go into a coffee shop, do you want to upsize into a bigger cup? That FOMO you feel when you're browsing online and you see this product and then suddenly you're told that hundreds of other people are browsing and there's only one left and you buy it and then, oh my God. All of this is being driven by behavioral science techniques. It's tapping into human psychology to get you to buy more stuff. Well, we can apply all these techniques in the same way to helping you to be more sustainable and more ethical. And I'm going to focus on 3 tactics just to bring it to life. Positive reinforcement, timely nudges, and social norms. So let's start with positive reinforcement. We see this playing out on social media platforms all the time, the number of likes, how important it is to get feedback and getting recognition. Well, when it comes to taking climate actions, it's even more important because we can't see or feel the physical impacts that we're having. We need to get that reinforcement and we need to see the benefit, especially because quite a few climate actions actually can feel like sacrifices, giving up meat, or you're taking the train versus them flying and it's taking all that time. People want these actions acknowledged. And also, what we know from our research is that people won't take further climate actions until their existing climate actions have been positively reinforced. So positive reinforcement is really key. The second is around personalised cues and nudges. These play a huge role in actually prompting people to reduce in a very timely and relevant manner. For example, here you can see, people are most likely to switch to a renewable energy provider when they're given a cue with their monthly energy bill. It's logical, right? They're also more susceptible to savings on their energy, sharing chips on energy saving. The cues need to be timely, they need to be relevant, and they are particularly powerful when they're linked to spend transactions. And more than ever today, especially when there's cost saving, and there is such a correlation for better for the planet and better for your pocket. And finally, a really powerful phenomenon in taking climate action is the phenomenon of social norms. Now, you may or may not be aware of social norms and how they play out, but this is the notion that you're more likely to take action when you know others like you have taken action. What we see is that as an individual, our actions feel very small when it comes to climate action. So when as a collective, it feels very impactful. But what we see is that this has a byproduct, that when other people see people taking action, they're more likely to jump in. Now, I've shown you some snippets of what we can do with carbon calculators, helping people to understand and measure and reduce their carbon emissions. But the big question I'm sure you're asking is, well, does it make a difference? Does it actually work? Well, we launched a Cogo app about 3 years ago on an open banking platform, and we got about 50,000 customers, and we were like, that's great. But actually, it wasn't really delivering scale and impact. We need to go where people are actually checking on their spend, and this is where the banks come in, because I knew you were wondering about those banks. So we're privileged to work with a number of the world's leading banks, including NatWest and ING and Commonwealth Bank, and we integrate this carbon calculator into their mobile banking experience. And it gives us amazing customer reach and potential for significant impact. Here's actually a quick example using NatWest that's live in market. We soft launched this about 10 months ago, and so far we've had about 300,000 customers engaging with their carbon footprint. We've seen 37% taking climate action. And this amazes me that 65% of consumers that we've researched have said they want a push notification from their bank. When have you ever wanted to hear from your bank? There's so much opportunity for banks and also to give financial support and incentives. And we've got packed roadmaps with these banks to really help transition to a low carbon lifestyle. So before I finish, I'm going to address the elephant in the room, because if I don't say it, then someone's going to ask it. Is this just all greenwashing, right? Let's just cut to the chase here. We're all very aware about the role that banks have played in terms of investing in fossil fuels and deforestation. And also, we're seeing banks are being called out, and not only banks, companies, and it erodes trust. The reality is banks do need to get their own house in order first. They need to stop investing in fossil fuels, they need to commit to Scope 3 reporting, and they need to commit to more green financing. But that being said, carbon calculators and the opportunity with their customer reach is significant. One bank we worked with showed that the collective carbon footprint of their customer base was 100 times bigger than their own operational footprint. And we've seen this, right? So we've seen hints of this. We did this pilot with NatWest, and we saw a carbon saving of 11 kgs per month. We extrapolated that over a portion of their customer base. And that could, in a year, give a carbon saving of 1 billion kilos. That's the equivalent of planting 17 million trees. There was another bank we worked with. It was a private wealth bank, smaller customer base of high net worth individuals. And we showed that those individuals, by taking a few climate actions, could reduce carbon emissions by 30%. That is the equivalent of the carbon emissions of the carbon footprint of Iceland. You know, the reality is banks have a big role to play in transitioning to a low-carbon economy. And we at Cogo have found that speed, collaboration, and innovation have been critical to delivering scale and impact. And I'm going to finish leaving you with this one thought, which is to address the climate crisis, we all need to harness the digital revolution to decarbonise the next industrial revolution. Thanks very much.